The air raid siren that wailed across Warsaw at precisely 5 o'clock in the afternoon on August 1st, 1944, was not warning of incoming German bombers as the sound usually signaled, but rather served as the prearranged signal for the Polish Home Army to begin an armed uprising against German occupation forces that had controlled the city since September 1939. Lieutenant Colonel Jan Mazurkiewicz, code-named Radoslaw, commanding Home Army forces in the Wola district, heard the siren and immediately gave the order his men had been waiting weeks to receive. Thousands of Polish fighters emerged from hiding places throughout Warsaw, donned white and red armbands identifying them as soldiers of the Polish resistance, and began attacking German positions with whatever weapons they had managed to accumulate through years of clandestine preparation. The timing of the uprising reflected calculations by Polish underground leaders that the rapid Soviet advance westward across Poland during July 1944 meant that Red Army forces would reach Warsaw within days, perhaps within hours, and that a Polish uprising liberating the capital before Soviet arrival would establish Polish sovereignty and prevent Stalin from simply imposing a communist puppet government on Poland as Soviet forces had done in other liberated territories. The Polish government in exile in London, led by Prime Minister Stanislaw Mikolajczyk, supported the uprising despite concerns about whether the Home Army possessed sufficient weapons and whether Soviet forces would actually provide the expected support once fighting began. The Home Army forces attempting to liberate Warsaw numbered approximately 50,000 fighters, though only about 2,500 possessed rifles, and most of the remainder carried only pistols, hand grenades, bottles for Molotov cocktails, or in many cases, nothing but courage and determination to fight despite being essentially unarmed. The insurgents had stockpiled ammunition and explosives in secret caches throughout the city, but quantities were desperately inadequate for sustained combat operations against a well-armed opponent. The plan assumed that significant quantities of weapons would be captured from German forces during the first days of fighting, and that Allied airdrops would provide additional supplies once the uprising was underway. German forces in Warsaw on August 1st totaled approximately 16,000 troops, though most were rear echelon units responsible for administration, logistics, and garrison duties rather than front-line combat troops. The city's garrison included police battalions, railway security units, administrative personnel, and various support troops who possessed military weapons but limited combat training and experience. However, German forces also included several thousand experienced combat troops from SS and Wehrmacht units that had been pulled back from the collapsing front lines east of Warsaw for rest and refitting, soldiers who had fought Soviet forces for months and who would prove far more formidable opponents than Polish planners had anticipated. The first hours of the uprising saw dramatic Polish successes as insurgents attacking by surprise overwhelmed isolated German positions, captured weapons and ammunition, and seized control of large areas of central Warsaw. Polish fighters stormed German offices, barracks, and supply depots, killing or capturing German personnel who were caught completely unprepared for coordinated attacks throughout the city. By nightfall on August 1st, Home Army forces controlled approximately 60% of Warsaw's urban area, including most residential districts, though German forces retained control of critical infrastructure, including bridges across the Vistula River, major roads, the main railway station, and several fortified strongpoints that would prove impossible to capture with the limited weapons available to Polish insurgents. The euphoria among Warsaw's civilian population during those first hours and days was extraordinary and deeply moving to anyone who witnessed it. After 5 years of brutal German occupation that had included the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Jews to death camps, the execution of resistance members and random civilians in public shootings designed to terrorize the population, and the systematic looting of Polish cultural treasures and economic resources, the sight of Polish fighters openly attacking German occupiers, and the sound of Polish flags being raised over liberated buildings created scenes of celebration that participants would remember for the rest of their lives, despite the tragedy that would follow. Women and children joined the fighting or supported it in countless ways despite the danger. Women served as couriers carrying messages and weapons through German-controlled areas, as medics treating wounded fighters in improvised field hospitals, as lookouts warning of German movements, and sometimes as combatants when weapons became available. Children as young as 10 or 12 served in the little insurgent units, carrying messages, delivering ammunition to fighting positions, and performing reconnaissance because their small size allowed them to move through rubble in tight spaces where adults couldn't fit. The participation of entire families in the uprising reflected both Polish determination to resist German occupation and the desperate shortage of trained soldiers that forced the Home Army to accept anyone willing to fight regardless of age or gender. The Soviet Army's response to the uprising, or rather its lack of response, would prove to be one of the most controversial aspects of the entire episode. Soviet forces under Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky had reached the Vistula River east of Warsaw by late July and appeared poised to cross the river and attack the city, exactly the scenario that had prompted Polish leaders to launch the uprising when they did. But Soviet forces stopped their advance at the Vistula and made no attempt to enter Warsaw or to provide direct military support to the Polish insurgents fighting there. Soviet aircraft disappeared from Warsaw's skies once the uprising began, and Soviet artillery that had been shelling German positions near Warsaw fell silent. The reasons for the Soviet halt have been debated extensively by historians, with no consensus reached beyond the obvious observation that Stalin had no interest in supporting a Polish resistance movement loyal to the London-based government in exile rather than to Soviet-backed Polish communists. Whether Soviet forces genuinely needed to pause and regroup after their rapid advance across Poland, as Soviet commanders claimed, or whether the halt was deliberately ordered by Stalin to allow German forces to destroy the Home Army and eliminate a potential obstacle to Soviet control of post-war Poland, remains contested. What is undeniable is that Soviet inaction during the critical weeks of the uprising doomed it to failure by ensuring that Polish fighters would receive no heavy weapons, no ammunition resupply beyond what could be airdropped, and no relief from the overwhelming German counterattack that was gathering strength throughout early August. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS and one of the most powerful figures in Nazi Germany, responded to news of the Warsaw Uprising with orders that reflected both his ideological fanaticism and his brutal pragmatism about how to suppress resistance. On August 1st, within hours of the uprising's beginning, Himmler ordered SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski to take command of all German forces in Warsaw and to crush the rebellion without regard for civilian casualties or property damage. Himmler's orders specifically stated that Warsaw should be razed to the ground and that the entire population should be killed or deported, instructions that reflected Nazi ideology about Slavic peoples and that would lead to some of the worst atrocities committed by German forces during World War II. Bach-Zelewski assembled a force of approximately 25,000 troops for the counterattack, combining regular Wehrmacht and SS units with some of the most notorious criminal formations in German service. The Dirlewanger Brigade, commanded by SS Oberfuhrer Oskar Dirlewanger, consisted largely of convicted criminals and SS personnel who had been court-martialed for various offenses and who were offered the choice between concentration camps and service in this penal unit. The brigade had compiled a horrific record of atrocities in anti-partisan operations in Belarus and elsewhere, and their deployment to Warsaw guaranteed that civilians would suffer regardless of whether they were participating in the uprising. The Rona Brigade, officially the Russian National Liberation Army, consisted of Russian collaborators under the command of Bronislav Kaminsky, a Russian engineer who had established a WWII, collaborationist statelet in the Lokot area of occupied Russia before German retreat forced his forces to withdraw westward. These troops had no particular loyalty to Germany, but fought for plunder and the opportunity to commit atrocities with German authorization. Their deployment alongside the Dirlewanger Brigade created a force whose conduct would shock even some German officers who witnessed what these units did during the suppression of the uprising. The German counterattack began on August 5th in the Wola district, the western area of Warsaw, where Polish forces had achieved some of their most significant initial successes. Dirlewanger and Rona forces, supported by regular Wehrmacht and SS units, attacked with artillery support and armored vehicles that Polish fighters had no effective weapons to counter. The fighting was brutal and conducted largely house to house as German forces methodically cleared buildings of Polish fighters and civilians alike, making no distinction between combatants and non-combatants in their determination to crush resistance and terrorize the population into submission. The Wola massacre that occurred over the following 3 days represented one of the worst single atrocities committed by German forces in occupied Europe. Dirlewanger and Rona troops systematically executed civilians in mass shootings, killing between 40,000 and 50,000 men, women, and children, in what German commanders apparently believed would break Polish will to continue resisting. Victims were gathered in groups, marched to execution sites including building courtyards, cemeteries, and open spaces, and machine-gunned. In some cases, entire apartment buildings were set on fire with residents still inside, the doors barricaded to prevent escape. Wounded Polish fighters captured during the fighting were executed on the spot rather than being taken prisoner. The massacre did not break Polish resistance, but rather intensified determination to fight, as insurgents understood that surrender meant death, regardless of whether they were combatants or civilians. The atrocities also horrified some German officers who witnessed them, with several Wehrmacht commanders filing protests about the conduct of the Dirlewanger and Rona units, and requesting that these formations be withdrawn from Warsaw because their actions violated even the permissive standards of German occupation warfare. These protests were ignored by Boxalewski and by Himmler, who viewed terror as an appropriate and effective tool for suppressing resistance. The Polish fighters defending Wola and other districts fought with desperate courage despite being overwhelmingly outgunned. Insurgents armed with rifles, pistols, hand grenades, and Molotov cocktails engaged German tanks, armored vehicles, and infantry supported by artillery and airstrikes. The Poles used their knowledge of the urban terrain to conduct ambushes, establish defensive positions in buildings that provided good fields of fire, and create improvised fortifications using rubble and furniture. But courage and tactical skill could not compensate for the enormous disparities in weapons and ammunition, and Polish positions throughout Wola fell one by one despite fierce resistance. The fighting generated refugees who fled from districts under German attack toward areas still controlled by Polish forces, creating a humanitarian crisis that complicated military operations and strained the limited food and medical supplies available in insurgent-held areas. Tens of thousands of civilians crowded into cellars and underground passages, seeking shelter from German artillery and air attacks, living in conditions that rapidly became unsanitary and that facilitated the spread of disease. Water supplies were disrupted when German forces captured pumping stations, and when damage to underground pipes from explosions and fires rendered large areas of the city without running water. Medical care for wounded insurgents and civilians was provided in improvised hospitals, established in cellars, schools, churches, and any other building that offered some protection from German fire. These facilities operated without adequate medical supplies, anesthesia, surgical instruments, or antibiotics, because the quantities that could be smuggled into Warsaw or captured from German stocks were utterly inadequate for treating the casualties that mounted daily as the fighting continued. Doctors and nurses performed surgery using whatever instruments were available, often without anesthesia, under conditions that would have been impossible in any normal hospital. Many wounded died from infections that would have been easily treatable with antibiotics, or from shock and blood loss that proper surgical care could have prevented. Polish forces established a sophisticated communication system using telephone lines that remained intact in underground conduits beneath streets where surface infrastructure had been destroyed. Messengers carried orders and reports through the city's sewer system, a dangerous journey through darkness, filth, and sometimes water, deep enough that short individuals had difficulty keeping their heads above the surface. The sewers also provided routes for moving fighters between districts when German control of surface streets made movement impossible, and for evacuating wounded when field hospitals became untenable due to German attacks. The Old Town district in central Warsaw became the site of particularly intense fighting throughout August, as German forces attempted to split Polish-controlled areas and to capture this symbolically important area containing many of Warsaw's historic buildings and monuments. Polish fighters defended from positions in buildings, cellars, and barricades constructed across streets using cobblestones torn up from roadways, furniture dragged from apartments, rubble from destroyed buildings, and anything else that might provide some protection against German fire. German forces attacked with artillery, tanks, flamethrowers, and eventually with remote-controlled explosive devices called Goliath tracked mines that could be driven into buildings and detonated. The fighting in Old Town followed a pattern that would repeat in other districts throughout the uprising. German forces would bombard Polish positions with artillery and bombs, destroying buildings and creating rubble that actually provided better defensive positions than intact structures, because rubble offered concealment and created obstacles slowing German infantry advances. Polish fighters would defend from positions in the rubble, inflicting casualties on attacking German troops while conserving their limited ammunition. When positions became untenable due to casualties, ammunition exhaustion, or the threat of being surrounded, Polish forces would withdraw through cellars and sewers to new positions where the fighting would continue. Allied attempts to supply the insurgents by air began in mid-August, after urgent appeals from Polish commanders made clear that ammunition shortages were becoming critical and that the uprising would fail unless significant resupply could be achieved. The British Royal Air Force conducted long-range missions from bases in Italy, flying approximately 150 miles round-trip in Halifax and Liberator bombers that approached Warsaw at low altitude to drop containers of weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, and food. These missions were extraordinarily dangerous because German anti-aircraft defenses around Warsaw were formidable, and because the long flight over occupied territory meant that damaged aircraft often couldn't reach friendly territory before running out of fuel or succumbing to battle damage. The supply drops achieved mixed results at best. Many containers fell in German-controlled areas where Polish forces couldn't retrieve them, providing weapons and supplies to German forces rather than to the intended recipients. Other containers were damaged on impact when parachutes failed to deploy properly, destroying fragile medical supplies and rendering ammunition unusable. The quantities that did reach Polish fighters were helpful, but nowhere near sufficient to meet the needs of 50,000 insurgents fighting continuously against well-supplied German forces. The RAF lost dozens of aircraft and hundreds of aircrew in these missions, and while Polish insurgents desperately appreciated the sacrifice, the military impact was minimal given the vast disparity between what was delivered and what was needed. The United States Army Air Force conducted one large-scale supply mission on September 18th, dropping supplies from approximately 110 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers flying from bases in England. This mission was more successful in terms of containers reaching Polish forces because the large number of aircraft dropping simultaneously overwhelmed German ability to retrieve containers before Polish fighters could reach them. But even this substantial effort provided only enough ammunition and supplies to sustain operations for a few days, rather than reversing the fundamental problem that Polish forces simply could not fight indefinitely against German heavy weapons with rifles, pistols, and grenades. The Soviet Union refused to allow Allied aircraft to land at Soviet-controlled airfields after dropping supplies in Warsaw, forcing them to make the long return flight to bases in Italy or England, and significantly reducing the frequency with which missions could be flown and the total tonnage that could be delivered. Stalin's refusal to cooperate with Allied supply efforts provided additional evidence that Soviet policy was to allow the Germans to destroy the home army rather than to support the uprising. Soviet aircraft finally began dropping supplies to Polish forces in mid-September after international pressure embarrassed Stalin into making some gesture of support. But Soviet drops often lacked parachutes, and containers simply fell from high altitude and buried themselves deep in rubble or crashed through buildings, destroying their contents. The Warsaw Old Town fell to German forces in early September after 4 weeks of intense fighting that left the district almost completely destroyed and that cost both sides thousands of casualties. Polish forces withdrew through the sewers to other districts still under insurgent control. A nightmarish journey through passages choked with refugees, wounded fighters, and in some cases German forces attempting to intercept the withdrawal. Hundreds of people drowned in the sewers or were killed by German troops who dropped explosives and poison gas into manholes attempting to prevent Polish movement through the underground network. The district of Cherniaków, situated along the Vistula River, appeared to offer opportunities for Polish forces to receive supplies and reinforcements from the East Bank, where Soviet forces were positioned. Several attempts were made to establish contact with Soviet forces and to arrange for Soviet crossing of the river to support the uprising. But these attempts failed due to a combination of German defensive efforts preventing river crossings and apparent Soviet unwillingness to commit forces to supporting the insurgents. A small group of Soviet-affiliated Polish communist troops did cross the Vistula and fought alongside Home Army forces in Cherniaków, but this was a minor contribution that did not alter the overall situation. German attacks on Cherniakov beginning in mid-September forced Polish forces to withdraw from this district as well, leaving the insurgents holding a shrinking area of central Warsaw that was becoming increasingly difficult to defend as German forces tightened their encirclement. The physical destruction of Warsaw by this point was extraordinary, with entire districts reduced to rubble by German artillery, bombing, and deliberate demolitions. Fires burned continuously, their smoke visible for miles, and the stench of death from thousands of bodies buried in rubble permeated the city. The civilian population trapped in the shrinking insurgent-controlled areas suffered terribly from food shortages, lack of clean water, inadequate shelter, disease, and the constant threat of German bombardment. Rations were reduced to starvation levels as stockpiles dwindled and supply drops failed to provide sufficient food. Water had to be obtained from wells or from damaged pipes, often under German fire, and always with the risk that the water was contaminated with sewage or corpses. Typhus and dysentery spread through the crowded cellars where civilians sheltered, killing particularly children and the elderly whose physical conditions had been weakened by weeks of inadequate food and unsanitary conditions. By late September, the military situation had become hopeless. Polish forces held only a few square kilometers of central Warsaw. German forces completely surrounded them. Ammunition was running out despite continued airdrops. Casualties had reduced the number of effective fighters by half, and no possibility existed for external relief given Soviet unwillingness to intervene and the impossibility of British or American ground forces reaching Warsaw. Home Army Commander General Tadeusz Komorowski faced the agonizing decision of whether to continue fighting despite the certainty of eventual defeat or to seek terms with German forces that might at least save the civilian population from complete annihilation. The decision to negotiate surrender was made on September 30th after Komorowski consulted with his staff and with civil authorities representing Warsaw's population. The negotiations with Wasilewski produced an agreement that granted Polish fighters combatant status under international law, meaning they would be treated as prisoners of war rather than as criminals or terrorists, as German authorities had initially insisted. German forces agreed to stop targeting civilians and to allow Red Cross personnel to establish themselves in Warsaw to provide humanitarian assistance. Polish forces agreed to cease combat operations and to surrender their weapons and remaining ammunition. The capitulation officially took effect on October 2, 1944, ending 63 days of fighting that had killed approximately 16,000 Polish fighters, between 150,000 and 200,000 Polish civilians, and about 17,000 German soldiers. The disparity in civilian casualties compared to combatant casualties reflected both the intensity of German artillery and air bombardment of populated areas, and the systematic massacres of civilians. The German forces, particularly the Durlwanger and Rona units, had conducted throughout the uprising. The number of civilian casualties made the Warsaw Uprising one of the deadliest single events of World War II, measured by the concentration of deaths in a small geographic area over a relatively short time period. The surviving Polish fighters, approximately 15,000 to 17,000, were marched into prisoner of war camps where most would remain until the war's end. Their treatment as POWs rather than as terrorists or criminals represented one of the few positive outcomes of the uprising, saving thousands of lives that would otherwise have been lost to execution or concentration camps. The agreement reflected Wasilewski's decision to treat the surrender as a military matter between armed forces rather than as the suppression of criminal activity, a decision that contradicted Himmler's earlier orders but that Baksalevsky apparently made based on recognition that further fighting would be costly for German forces and that achieving a negotiated surrender served German interests. The civilian population of Warsaw, approximately 500,000 to 600,000 people who had survived the fighting, were ordered to evacuate the city. German forces conducted systematic sweeps through the ruined districts, forcing civilians to leave and loading them onto trains for transport to refugee camps, labor camps, or in some cases concentration camps, depending on German assessments of their potential usefulness as labor or their perceived danger as potential resistance members. Approximately 60,000 civilians were sent to concentration camps, including Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and others, where many would die from starvation, disease, or execution. The remainder were distributed to various labor camps or refugee facilities throughout Germany and occupied Poland. After evacuating the population, German forces systematically destroyed what remained of Warsaw through deliberate demolition using explosives, flamethrowers, and bulldozers. Special demolition units moved through the city block by block, dynamiting buildings that had survived the fighting, burning those that would burn, and reducing Warsaw to rubble and ash. The destruction was methodical and thorough, apparently driven by Himmler's August orders that Warsaw should be razed and by German determination to eliminate a symbol of Polish resistance and to punish the population for having rebelled against German occupation. By January 1945, when Soviet forces finally entered Warsaw during their winter offensive toward Germany, approximately 85% of the city's buildings had been completely destroyed, and the remaining 15% were severely damaged. The population, which had exceeded 1.3 million before the war, had been reduced to fewer than 1,000 people, mostly individuals who had hidden successfully during the forced evacuation and who had survived in the ruins during the months when Warsaw was essentially a dead city, inhabited only by German demolition teams and patrols. The devastation exceeded that suffered by any other major European city during World War II, including cities like Dresden and Hamburg that had been subjected to massive aerial bombardment. The question of responsibility for the uprising's failure and for the catastrophic casualties it inflicted on Warsaw's population generated intense debate among Polish leaders and continues to generate historical controversy. Some argued that launching the uprising was a terrible mistake, that Polish leaders should have recognized that Soviet unwillingness to support the effort made success impossible, and that condemning Warsaw to destruction for political objectives that were never achieved represented criminally irresponsible decision-making. Others defended the decision to launch the uprising, arguing that Polish leaders had reasonable expectations of Soviet support based on the proximity of Soviet forces to Warsaw, and that the uprising represented necessary resistance to German occupation, even if military success proved impossible. The Soviet role in the uprising's failure remains particularly controversial. Stalin's decision to halt Soviet forces at the Vistula River and to refuse to provide direct military support to the Polish insurgents clearly contributed to the uprising's failure, and many historians argue that Stalin deliberately allowed the Germans to destroy the Home Army to eliminate a potential obstacle to Soviet control of post-war Poland. Soviet sources claim that military necessity required the halt and that Soviet forces were exhausted after their rapid advance and needed time to regroup and resupply before attempting to cross the Vistula and attack Warsaw. Whether this explanation reflects genuine military constraints or whether it represents post hoc justification for a politically motivated decision remains debated. The Polish government in exile's relationship with the Soviet Union was irrevocably poisoned by the Warsaw Uprising and by Soviet conduct during it. Polish leaders who had reluctantly accepted cooperation with the Soviet Union as necessary for defeating Germany concluded that Stalin had no interest in genuine Polish independence and that Soviet control of Poland would simply replace German occupation with Soviet occupation. This realization contributed to the political tensions that would eventually lead to the establishment of a Soviet-dominated communist government in post-war Poland, rather than the democratic government that the London-based exile government represented. The impact on Polish society and on the survivors who had lived through the uprising was profound and long-lasting. Those who fought in the uprising carried both pride in having resisted German occupation and guilt about the civilian casualties that the fighting had caused and that might have been avoided if the uprising had never been launched. Survivors struggled with trauma from witnessing atrocities, from living through weeks of combat under terrible conditions, and from losing family members and friends in circumstances that seemed increasingly senseless as the inevitability of defeat became apparent. The destruction of Warsaw and the dispersal of its population disrupted social networks and community structures that had existed for generations. The reconstruction of Warsaw after the war became a matter of national pride and a symbol of Polish determination to rebuild, despite the catastrophic destruction the city had suffered. The decision was made to reconstruct the city rather than to abandon the ruins and build elsewhere, and the reconstruction emphasized restoring Warsaw's historic character by rebuilding many destroyed buildings according to historical designs and by preserving the layout of streets and public spaces that had existed before the war. The Old Town was completely rebuilt based on historical drawings, paintings, and photographs, creating a reconstruction so complete that it would eventually be designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site as an example of exceptional reconstruction of destroyed cultural heritage. The communist government that controlled Poland after the war faced complicated questions about how to commemorate the Warsaw Uprising, given that the uprising had been organized by the Home Army, loyal to the London-based government, rather than by communist resistance organizations. For decades, official commemoration was limited or suppressed because acknowledging the Home Army's role in the uprising conflicted with the communist narrative that emphasized Soviet liberation of Poland and minimized non-communist resistance contributions. Survivors of the uprising faced discrimination and sometimes persecution because their service in the Home Army marked them as potentially disloyal to the communist government. After the fall of communism in 1989, Polish society could finally openly commemorate the Warsaw Uprising and honor those who had fought and died during the 63 days of combat. Memorials were erected throughout Warsaw. Museums were established dedicated to preserving the uprising's history, and August 1st became an official day of remembrance when sirens sound throughout Poland at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the time when the uprising began, and Poles pause for a moment of silence, honoring those who fought. The anniversary observances include wreath-laying ceremonies, concerts, exhibitions, and educational programs, ensuring that subsequent generations understand what happened in Warsaw during those terrible weeks in 1944. The Warsaw Uprising Museum, opened in 2004 on the uprising's 60th anniversary, presents comprehensive exhibits about the uprising, including artifacts, photographs, documents, personal testimonies, and multimedia presentations that allow visitors to understand the uprising's context, course, and consequences. The museum has become one of Warsaw's most visited cultural institutions, and serves as a center for research and education about the uprising. Its popularity reflects Polish society's determination to preserve memory of the uprising and to honor the courage and sacrifice of those who participated, even while acknowledging the tragedy of how it ended. The military lessons from the Warsaw Uprising were studied by various armed forces after the war, particularly regarding urban warfare, civilian-military relations during urban combat, the challenges of sustaining insurgent forces in cities, and the effectiveness of different tactical approaches to urban fighting. The uprising demonstrated the extreme difficulty of liberating cities from determined defenders who possess heavy weapons and who are willing to accept massive destruction to maintain control. It showed the importance of external support for urban insurgencies, particularly the need for heavy weapons and resupply that insurgent forces cannot generate internally. It revealed the terrible civilian costs of urban warfare when combat occurs in densely populated areas. The personal stories of individuals who participated in the uprising and who survived to tell their experiences provide the most powerful testimony about what happened in Warsaw during those 63 days. The young woman who served as a courier, carrying messages between Home Army units, despite knowing that capture meant torture and execution. The doctor who performed surgery in a cellar without anesthesia or proper instruments, trying to save wounded fighters and civilians with only the most basic supplies. The teenage boy who fought with a captured German rifle until he ran out of ammunition, then continued fighting with Molotov cocktails and stones. The mother who sheltered her children in a cellar for weeks while the building above them burned and collapsed, somehow keeping them alive until the surrender. The elderly man who chose to remain in Warsaw after the evacuation, living in the ruins alone for months until Soviet forces arrived in January 1945. These individual stories, and thousands like them, provide the human dimension that statistics about casualties and destroyed buildings cannot capture. Each person who lived through the Warsaw Uprising carried memories of specific moments, specific decisions, specific losses that shaped the rest of their lives. The young man who watched his friend die from wounds that could have been treated in a proper hospital, but who bled to death in a cellar because there was no way to get him to medical care. The woman who had to abandon her home carrying only what she could hold, knowing she would never see her possessions or her neighborhood again. The child who witnessed atrocities that no child should ever see and who would struggle for decades with trauma that had no treatment in the immediate post-war years. The Warsaw Uprising stands as one of the most tragic episodes of World War II, a story of immense courage and determination by people fighting against brutal occupation, but also a story of catastrophic casualties and destruction that raises profound questions about the decisions that led to the uprising being launched when it was, and whether those decisions can be justified by the outcomes they produced. The military result was complete failure, with German forces maintaining control of Warsaw until Soviet armies captured the city 4 months after the uprising ended, and with the Home Army effectively destroyed as a fighting force. The political objective of establishing Polish sovereignty before Soviet forces arrived was never achieved, as Stalin imposed a communist government on Poland, regardless of the uprising and regardless of the London government's claims to legitimacy. But measuring the Warsaw Uprising only by its military and political failures misses important aspects of what it represented and what it meant to those who participated. For the fighters and civilians who lived through the uprising, it represented a moment when Poles actively resisted their oppressors rather than passively accepting occupation, and when the Polish nation demonstrated through actions rather than words its determination to be free regardless of the costs. The fact that the uprising failed to achieve its immediate objectives and that it resulted in catastrophic destruction does not negate the courage and sacrifice of those who fought or the legitimacy of their desire to free their city from occupation by forces that had committed unspeakable crimes against Poland since 1939. The German atrocities committed during the suppression of the uprising, particularly the mass executions of civilians in Wola and other districts, removed any possible moral justification German authorities might have claimed for their actions in Warsaw. The decision to systematically destroy the city after forcing the population to evacuate revealed the nihilistic brutality of Nazi occupation policy and the complete disregard for Polish lives and Polish cultural heritage that characterized German treatment of occupied Poland. The Durlwanger and Rona units, whose crimes shocked even other German commanders, demonstrated the depths of depravity that occupation forces could reach when commanded by individuals like Oskar Durlwanger and Bronislaw Kamiński, who were essentially criminals given uniforms and official sanction for atrocities. The air raid siren that wailed across Warsaw at 5 o'clock on August 1, 1944, began a sequence of events that would unfold over 63 days of brutal urban warfare that would kill between 150,000 and 200,000 civilians and approximately 16,000 Polish fighters, that would result in the almost complete destruction of one of Europe's great historic cities, and that would raise questions about military decision-making, about resistance ethics, about the human costs of symbolic actions, and about the responsibilities that leaders bear when they make decisions affecting the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. The uprising's failure makes its story tragic rather than triumphant, but the courage and sacrifice of those who fought deserve remembrance and honor, even as we acknowledge the terrible consequences that resulted from the decision to fight.